Janet was a very beautiful girl. People around her often said she looks like a queen, with a smile that could brighten even the gloomiest day. Many men had tried to win her heart. They came with gifts and promises of a comfortable life. But Janet's answer was always the same. Her heart belonged to Sammy. Sammy was a simple guy, a barber who worked tirelessly in his small shop in the nearby town. He wasn't wealthy, and his earnings barely kept the two of them afloat. But Sammy had a heart full of love and a spirit of determination. Janet admired him for his hard work and the way he treated her like she was the most important person in the world. Their love was pure and unshakable. While others questioned why Janet, a woman who could have any man of her choice, chose Sammy, she never doubted her decision. To her, Sammy was everything: a husband, a friend, and a partner she could trust. One fateful evening, Sammy had just returned from his barber shop, tired and hungry. As always, Janet greeted him at the door with a warm smile, wiping her hands off her apron as the scent of egusi soup filled the room. Sammy's eyes lit up. He knew she had prepared his favorite meal, just as she always did when she noticed he looked particularly tired. "Ah, Janet," he said with a tired laugh, "you're spoiling me too much." She chuckled, handing him a towel. "Go and freshen up, my king. Dinner will be ready in a minute." Sammy headed to their small bathroom, humming one of the songs he had heard from a customer earlier that day. Sammy quickly dressed up and headed to the dining. The scent of her irresistible soup was everywhere in the room, and Sammy was eager to devour the food. "This smells so good," he said, rubbing his hands together as he made his way to the dining table. But before he could take another step, he felt a sharp pain through his heart. It stopped him in his tracks. His face twisted in agony as he clutched at his heart. "Janet," he gasped, his voice barely audible. Sammy dropped to his knees as he struggled with his breath. Janet quickly rushed out from the kitchen. "Sammy, what's wrong?" she cried, rushing to his side. Her hand trembled as she grabbed his shoulders, trying to understand what was going on. I can't." Sammy's words faded, his face pale and drenched in sweat. Janet's mind raced. She didn't understand what was happening, but the fear in Sammy's eyes terrified her. "Help!" she screamed, her voice cracking as she held him close. Her noise brought neighbors running, their concerned voices filling the room, but Janet didn't hear them. All she could focus on was Sammy, the man she loved more than anything, lying helplessly in her arms. The neighbors had acted quickly. They carried Sammy into a car as Janet sat beside him and drove him to the hospital. When they arrived at the hospital, the nurses rushed Sammy into the emergency room, leaving Janet pacing the waiting room. Her thoughts were wearied of fear and confusion. "What's happening? Why Sammy?" she whispered to herself. The minutes felt like hours until the doctor finally stepped out with a sad expression. "Madam, are you his wife?" he asked. "Yes, I am," Janet replied in a trembling voice. The doctor signed and motioned for her to sit. "The husband has a severe heart condition. It's life-threatening, and he will need surgery as soon as possible." "Surgery?" she asked in a barely audible voice. "Yes," the doctor continued, "and it won't be cheap. We will need $20,000 to proceed." The number hit her like a hammer. $20,000? Where was she supposed to find such an amount? Janet blinked, her mind struggling to process the reality of the situation. She looked at the doctor, hoping he would say something different, but his expression told her there was no room for negotiation. She nodded numbly and left the office, her legs barely carrying her back to the waiting area. Sammy was stable for now, the doctor had said, but he didn't have much time. When Janet reached their small apartment, she collapsed into the floor, the tears she had been holding all day finally breaking free. Her sobs filled the room as she clenched her chest, overwhelmed by the fear of losing her beloved husband. She talked about their life together, how Sammy had always worked so hard to provide for them. He didn't deserve this. None of this felt fair. Janet buried her face in her hands, her cries growing louder. Where would she find the money? Their savings weren't even close to what was needed, and their families were as poor as they were. For the first time in her life, Janet felt truly helpless. She needed a miracle, but the harsh reality was that miracles didn't come easily. Janet couldn't sleep that night as her mind raced for solutions. She remembered Sammy's uncle, Mr. Uche, a very wealthy businessman with a reputation for helping people in need. Stories of his generosity were well known in their community, and though Janet had never met him in person, she decided to seek him out. She couldn't sit by and watch Sammy slip away. That morning, Janet dressed up and set off for Mr. Uche's grand house on the outskirts of town. The mansion stood tall, surrounded by high gates and well-manicured lawns. A security guard let her in after she introduced herself, and soon she was ushered into a spacious living room filled with expensive furniture and art. Mr. Uche appeared shortly, a tall man in his late 50s, with a confident air. He smiled warmly when he saw Janet. "Ah, Sammy's wife," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "I've heard a lot about you. You're even more beautiful in person." "Good morning, sir," Janet said as she tried to remain composed. "Thank you for seeing me." "What brings you here, my dear?" he asked, leaning back in his chair. Janet hesitated, her hands gripping her bag tightly. "Sir, it's Sammy. He's in the hospital, and the doctor says he needs surgery. It's a matter of life and death, and we don't have the money." Her voice cracked, but she pushed on. "Please, sir, you are the only one who can help us." Mr. Uche rubbed his chin, pretending to think deeply. $20,000 is a lot of money, he said slowly. "I know, sir," Janet replied, her eyes pleading. "But Sammy is your nephew. He looks up to you. Please, help us save his life." Mr. Uche leaned forward, his smile shifting to something darker. "You are right. Sammy is my blood. But let me be honest, Janet. I have always admired you, more than I should." His eyes lingered on her in a way that made her skin crawl. "What do you mean, sir?" Janet asked, her voice unsteady. "I will help you," he said, "but on one condition. You will spend the night with me." Janet's heart dropped, her eyes popping out in shock. "What?" she whispered, hoping she had misheard him. "You heard me," he said, his voice now very firm. "I will give you the money, but I want you, just once. No one has to know." Janet stood there shocked and surprised, her face burning with anger and shame. "How dare you say that to me? Sammy is dying, and you're talking about this? He's your nephew." Mr. Uche shrugged, unfazed. "I'm offering you a way to save him. You need the money, and I have it. It's your choice, Janet. But don't waste my time pretending you have other options." Tears welled up in her eyes, but Janet refused to let them fall. "I can't do this," she said, her voice shaking. "I won't." "Suit yourself then," Mr. Uche said arrogantly, standing to show her a way out. "But when you change your mind, you know where to find me." Janet left the house that day with her stomach twisting with disgust and anger. The weight of his words hung over her like a dark cloud. She had hoped for help, but now she was faced with a choice that no woman would ever have to make. That night, Janet could not sleep. She sat down in their quiet home, scribbling a list of people she could borrow money from. She thought of friends, neighbors, and even the women she bought foodstuff from at the market. But the truth was, no one she knew could come close to offering the kind of money needed for Sammy's surgery. By dawn, her list was filled with crossed-out names, and her hopes was fading fast. She arrived at the hospital, clutching Sammy's favorite meal in a small container. He was lying on the bed, pale and weak, with dark circles under his eyes. Her heart broke at the sight of him, but she forced a smile as she sat by his side. "Janet," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You have been crying. What's wrong?" "It's nothing," she lied, taking his hand. "I'll fix everything. You'll be back home soon." Before Sammy could respond, the doctor entered, wearing a serious face. Janet stood up immediately, bracing herself for more bad news. "Mrs. Sammy," he began, "your husband's health is deteriorating faster than we expected. If the surgery isn't carried out in the next 3 days, I'm afraid there's nothing we can do." The words struck her like a blow. "3 days?" she repeated, her voice cracking. The doctor nodded. "I'm sorry, but it's critical. He doesn't have much time left." Janet's knees felt weak as she sat back into her chair. She looked at Sammy, who smiled faintly at her, as if to reassure her that everything would be okay. But it wasn't okay. Janet was running out of time, and every second felt like another nail in the coffin of her hope. That evening, when Janet got home, Janet made the hardest decision of her life. She returned to Mr. Uche's mansion, her hands trembling as she knocked on the door. He greeted her with the same smug smile, as if he had been expecting her. "Janet," he said, leaning casually against the doorframe. "I knew you would come back." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Please, Mr. Uche, Sammy doesn't have much time. I will do anything. Just help me save him." Mr. Uche's smile widened. "I told you the terms, Janet. I haven't changed my mind." Her stomach churned as she nodded, her tears falling freely. "I will do it," she said, the words feeling like a shard of glass in her throat. "Good," Mr. Uche said, leading her into the house. "You're making the right decision. Sammy is lucky to have someone who loves him so much as you do." But as Janet followed him, her heart shattered into pieces. This wasn't love. This was sacrifice, the kind that tore a person apart. Yet, as much as she hated herself for it, she knew she could endure anything to save the man she loved, even if it meant losing a part of herself forever. Janet left Mr. Uche's house just before dawn, holding an envelope filled with the money that could save Sammy's life. Her steps were hurried. Her body trembled as the events of the night played over and over again in her mind. She felt broken, like a part of her soul had been ripped away, but she couldn't allow herself to dwell on it. Sammy needed her, and that was all that mattered. When she arrived at the hospital, she went straight to the doctor's office and handed him over the money. "Here, please start the surgery. Don't waste any more time," she said. The doctor opened the envelope, counted the money, and nodded. "We will begin immediately. Your husband is lucky to have someone as determined as you are." "I admire your courage, Mrs. Sammy." Janet said nothing, only nodding as the doctor left. She made her way to Sammy's room, where he lay weak and pale, his breathing shallow. She took his hand as her tears fell onto his skin. "Janet," Sammy murmured, his voice faint. "You did it. You found the money." She simply forced a smile, her heart breaking at the sight of him. "Yes, Sammy, don't worry. Everything will be okay." "How did you—" he began, but she pressed a finger to his lips. "Don't worry about that," she said gently. "God provided. Just rest." Sammy smiled weakly, closing his eyes as the nurses arrived to wheel him to the operating room. Janet watched as he was taken away, her heart a storm of relief, guilt, and fear. The hours dragged on as she sat in the waiting room, her fingers clenched tightly together. She prayed silently, begging for Sammy's life while trying to suppress the haunting memories of what she had done. After some hours, the doctor appeared with a calm expression. "The surgery was successful," he said. "He's stable now and will make a full recovery." Janet let out a sob of relief, her knees nearly buckling under the weight of her emotion. She thanked the doctor repeatedly before rushing to see Sammy. When she entered the room, Sammy was awake. His face was pale but filled with gratitude. He smiled as he reached out to hold her hand. "You saved me, Janet," he said softly. "I don't know how you did it, but you saved me." Janet took his hand. "I love you, Sammy. That's all that matters." As Sammy drifted back to sleep, Janet sat by his side, her tears silent but unrelenting. She had saved the man she loved, but the price of that salvation weighed heavily on her soul. The days following Sammy's recovery were some of the happiest Janet had seen in a long time. For the first time in weeks, laughter returned to their little home. Sammy was back on his feet, his energy slowly returning as he regained his strength. To anyone looking from the outside, they seemed like a couple who had triumphed over a storm, stronger and more in love than ever. One evening, as they sat together in their modest bedroom, Sammy looked at Janet with a thoughtful expression. "You know," he began, his voice soft, "I still can't believe I'm here, alive and well. I owe it all to you." Janet's heart skipped a beat, but she managed to smile. "You don't owe me anything, Sammy. I did what any wife would do." He nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Still, I have to ask, Janet, how did you manage to find that kind of money? I know we don't have it. Did someone help you?" Janet froze for a moment, her chest tightening. The truth was right there, threatening to spill out. but she pulled it down. She looked at Sammy and placed a hand on him. "Don't worry about that," she said softly. "God provided, Sammy." He made the way when there seemed to be none. Sammy searched her face for a moment, then smiled. "God is good," he said. "I won't ask any more questions. I'm just grateful to be alive and to have you by my side." Janet simply nodded, forcing a smile as tears pricked her eyes. Sammy was still recovering, and she didn't want anything to bother him. Life had begun to return to normal for Janet and Sammy. Everything seemed perfect and okay, but a few weeks later, Janet began to feel sick. It started with fatigue and constant headache, but soon her body weakened and she could barely get out of bed. Sammy insisted on taking her to the hospital, concerned that she might have caught a serious illness. At the hospital, after several tests, the doctor's expression grew grave. He put Janet and Sammy aside to deliver the news. "Mrs. Sammy," the doctor began carefully, "the tests have confirmed that you are HIV positive." Janet's heart stopped. The room seemed to spin as the words sank in. "HIV?" she whispered, in a voice that is barely audible. Sammy's face contorted in confusion and shock. "That's impossible," he said. "Doctor, are you sure?" The doctor nodded. "I'm very certain. I recommend you both get tested immediately. Early detection is key to managing the condition," he said. When they got home that day, Sammy turned to her, his voice sharp. "Janet, how did this happen? What haven't you told me?" Tears welled up in her eyes and she fell to her knees. "Sammy, I'm so sorry," she sobbed. "I didn't want to lose you. I had no other choice." "What are you talking about?" Sammy demanded. "The money for your surgery. I went to your uncle, Mr. Uche, for help. He said he would give me the money, but only if I slept with him." Her voice broke as she spoke. "I refused at first, but the doctor said you had only 3 days to live. I had to do it, Sammy. I did it for you." Sammy stared at her, his face twisted with anger and disbelief. "You did what?" he shouted. "You slept with my uncle, my own uncle." "I didn't want to," Janet cried. "I had no other choice. He refused to help unless I agreed." "Sammy, I only did it to save your life." Sammy stepped back, shaking his head. "Don't you dare try to justify this," he said coldly. "You betrayed me, Janet. You brought shame to me and to our marriage. And now this. You are HIV positive because of your filthy actions," he shouted at her. "Sammy, please, please," Janet begged, crawling towards him. "I love you, and I did it for you. Please forgive me." But Sammy's face was like stone. "You are no longer my wife," he said. "Pack your things and leave. I can't be with a woman like you. You disgust me." Janet cried uncontrollably. She pleaded with him to reconsider, but Sammy turned his back on her. He refused to listen. His mind was made up. That evening, Janet packed all her belongings in tears. As she walked out of the house, her heart broke into pieces. She had given everything for Sammy, but in the end, her sacrifice had cost her everything. Outside, the night was cold and unwelcoming. Janet had nowhere to go, but she knew one thing for certain. Her love for Sammy had destroyed her, and the man who had promised to love her forever had cast her aside like she was nothing. She remembered Mr. Uche's smug expression that night as he insisted on sleeping with her without protection. His words still echoing in her ears. "I want you as you are. No barriers. If you want this money, this is how it will be," he said. Janet had begged him that night to reconsider, but he refused. His power over her was unyielding, and there was nothing she could do to change his mind. Thank you so much for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe and let me know what you think of this story in the comment section. Until I bring you another amazing story. Bye!